Hello, SOCA1010 students. Welcome to week 7. I hope you had a fantastic semester break and you're all ready to leap right back into the course this week. So this week we're focusing on globalisation and social change, which I think is a really interesting topic to be discussing, especially at the contemporary time in which globalisation is taking something of a new shape or being buffeted by some new forces due to the pandemic. That's something I'm going to touch on at the end of the lecture. But nonetheless, I think it's really fascinating to consider the kind of pathway taken by globalization, how we've gotten to the kind of global order that we have at present, and how that might change in the present and very near future, or what might persist and stay the same. So before I launch right into it, I'll just quickly note I'm sorry if I sound a little bit funny this week. I've got an absolutely terrible cold and I think I'm losing my voice. So I apologize if I'm a little bit difficult to hear or I sound a bit nasal or something like that. I'm sure I'll be back to my usual dulcet tones in the next lecture. You'll just have to bear with me until then. So to start off with, we can consider how to define globalization, and the simplest definition is that globalization basically consists of the intensified circulation of many things, such as capital, which means money, goods, information, and people across national boundaries. So it means the increased circulation of all of the kind of ingredients of our contemporary society. The other thing that I would add here that fits within information, people, and goods and capital even, but is not overt within this definition, is elements of culture. So this week especially, we're focusing on globalization and looking at it across kind of 3 key axes. So we can think of it as economic globalization, political globalization, and cultural globalization. And of course, these are not entirely discrete, but I think dividing globalization into these kind of categories can help us to think through some of the processes of globalization and what they mean. So it's kind of a useful schema for thinking through. So that's something to keep in mind as we kind of continue to move forward today. So I think when we're talking about globalization, we can have a very short time frame that would immediately come to mind. We think of globalization as something that's inherent to our kind of modern era, but that's kind of not necessarily true. It is a very recent phenomena. I've written down here on the slides just how recent it is and how recent our kind of stage of human existence and development is in the context of our planet. But nonetheless, globalization is something that has been around for many centuries, or many centuries. It's probably the best way to put it. So if we're trying to think about what the history of globalization looks like, the type of globalization that we would talk about most of the time would generally start kind of post 1950s, so the kind of post World War II world in which there was rebuilding efforts, efforts towards kind of decolonization, and then the next stage of globalization would be the end of the Cold War and a sense of a more united world in 1989. So I think those are the 2 points in which we would maybe unreflexively think of globalization kind of occurring, or the contemporary globalization coming about. But the kind of history of interconnected nation states, the history of crossing national boundaries and such is much older than that, and those types of things do fit into this overall idea of globalization. So we have all of the kind of colonial developments, expansions of the slave trade, the US and French revolutions, which we need to remember that the US and France were kind of helping each other during those processes. The French were helping the US more than the US helped France. I don't think they were particularly helpful to France at all in that particular revolution, but nonetheless, there was, a clear exchange of people and military weapons and ideas and philosophies, all of those kinds of things. So globalization is really as old as human civilizations and as old as the ability to travel, or more accurately, I suppose, it's probably as old as the idea of empires or nation states or ownership of land by an imagined community of people. But we're focusing particularly on the rise of globalization in the modern world. So those kind of final two developments, the post-World War II kind of rise of these global institutions. So this would be a kind of political globalization, the rise of things like the UN that bring the kind of nations of the world together in an effort to cooperate and find political common ground, and the economic globalization represented by things like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which have their roots earlier but really more more kind of overt and in the post World War II era. And yeah, so this is the kind of point at which we're focusing. And at present, I think, well, in the most recent estimate in about March of 2020, the world's population stood at about 7.8 billion inhabitants. So when we think about global interconnections, we're thinking about the interconnections of people moving between nation states, and we're thinking of ideas and information going between people in different countries. So if you imagine communication and sharing of ideas and movement by that many people, you can probably see globalization is something that's becoming incredibly kind of complex with the growth of the human population. So when we're trying to think about globalization, we have a range of theorists that can help us to elucidate certain kind of aspects of it. So we have to start off with world systems theory by Immanuel Wallerstein. It was trying to think about the production system, or how goods are produced in the context of the entire globe rather than just the context of a single country. So this is really a theory of the kind of globalization of production and manufacturing. And so Wallerstein's theory is that it's that cheap labor and raw materials and such are kind of taken from what he would call the periphery countries. So these are countries that we would think of as part of the global south, part of the developing world. So in our contemporary world, that would be many parts of Asia, somewhere like Bangladesh, where we have production kind of happening. And so Wallerstein argued that in his particular model, the kind of periphery countries were producing raw materials. So producing things like cotton, for instance, and then the core countries. So this would be at this particular time the kind of colonial powers. Places like England were extracting the kind of raw materials and cheap labor from these periphery countries, and at this particular point in time, manufacturing was still happening kind of onshore. So Wallerstein's world systems theory operates in the kind of pre-1970s era. So it's kind of at the beginning of the particular phase of globalization that we're talking about. So Wallerstein argued that these core countries essentially extracted these resources and these types of cheap labor and turned these raw materials into high profit consumer goods, which were often sold back to periphery countries sold to the population in the core countries, and also sold to countries in what he would call the semi-periphery. So this is, for instance, places like Portugal, which is somewhere that back in this time, merchants and such would be kind of crossing through, and it was, in some ways, exploiting some periphery countries, but at the same time was exploited in its own way by the core. So it kind of sat between them in the semi-periphery zone. And so when we get to the 1970s, things begin to change in this kind of global division of manufacturing, this kind of economic form of globalization that has political underpinnings. So in the 1970s, we have wars and oil crises. So this meant that the ability to be getting materials from many of the periphery countries became more difficult. The price of oil meant transportation was becoming more and more expensive. And as well, productivity improvements started to meet ceilings. And this is important when it's coupled with the fact that at this time in the core countries, wages were growing. So the in many of these countries, unions were gaining strength, and the sense of employers having obligations to their employees. In Australia, for instance, paying things like superannuation, although that didn't come about till the 90s. But obligations such as the need to provide like sick pay or loading for casual workers, the need to provide a decent minimum wage, that began to outstrip the profit margin. So it got to the point where it was no longer profitable for manufacturing to be happening onshore, essentially. And at the same time as this, transportation and communication, these technologies developed enough to make it possible to actually be manufacturing in one country and running the kind of business in a whole nother country. So this is what Doreen Massey, who's a geographer, would call the new spatial division of labour, a new division of labour across the world, essentially. And this is really what we have now, or to a large extent what we have now. At the same time as this as well, the popularity of mass-produced goods started to decline a little bit. So the golden age of the consumer goods, and the golden age of everyone wanting to have a refrigerator in their home and wanting to have a television in their home, the allure of these kind of mass-produced items where everyone on your street would have exactly the same one became, somewhat less. There was a growing desire for to have more personalized things, more personalized possessions. So that's something I'll speak about in a moment. But essentially, all of these developments kind of came together to change what this division of labour looked like. So now the periphery countries were essentially where the manufacturing was happening. So it was no longer that simply resources were kind of drawn from these countries and taken to these core countries where they were made into consumer goods, such as materials and such, and things like that. It was instead that manufacturing started to happen in places where it was a bit cheaper to do manufacturing, where there were less stringent labour regulations. So this is really the birth of the sweatshops. So we know from about the 1970s to the 1990s was the rise of the kind of sweatshop and like commercial zones in many parts of the global south, especially many parts of Asia. And so the result of this was really kind of movement towards multinational or transnational corporations in which manufacturing is happening in countries with really low labour costs and often kind of poor working conditions. And then at the same time, there's movement towards new types of manufacturing. So instead of producing just be the same thing forever. There was a movement towards consumer-led products, or the kind of production that was led by consumer demand. So H&M is a great example of this. They can get clothing from looks on the runway to their store in something like 6 weeks, because they've worked out how to get their supply chains to make that happen really, really quickly. Because that's really what the market appears to be demanding. This is referred to as a post-Fordist form of manufacturing. So if Fordism is kind of a production line where everything ends up the same, then post-Fordism is a more flexible form of production. So the point that I'm making here is about the kind of economic changes in the global distribution of labor and the global distribution of things like manufacturing, which has had an enormous impact on kind of economic dimensions of globalization. So if we're thinking about industrial societies, so these are the societies in which a large majority of people are kind of working in factories, offices, shops, rather than agriculture. A majority of people live in kind of towns or cities. There's a movement out of agrarian kind of farm-based modes of production and into the cities, and into kind of working in large-scale organizations, businesses, corporations, government agencies, all of these types of things. Then this is kind of part of what we start to see. So there's industrializing societies where there's still some elements of manufacturing happening onshore. This is somewhere like China would be a really great example. We think of that as a society that's very much in transition, and then we can think of many parts of the global north, such as Australia, America, as in the US and the UK, as post-industrial societies where we don't really make anything anymore. We have service and knowledge economies where we're either kind of doing what we can think of as knowledge work, so kind of office work a lot of the times, or we're kind of selling specific services through like hospitality or retail or tourism and leisure and that type of thing. And one of the kind of interesting things to keep an eye on in terms of the kind of economic globalization and economic development is newly industrialized countries or industrializing countries. So we have industrializing cities such as Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Jakarta in Indonesia. So the kind of growth rates of these cities, well, not Rio de Janeiro at present, obviously, because it's very adversely affected by COVID, but prior to that at least, were experiencing booming economic growth. And so we have these newly industrialized countries as this kind of interesting transitional cases in economic forms of globalization. But I think it's important to consider that economic globalization also, we've been talking so much so far about the kind of globalization of manufacturing. We've been talking about stuff moving between countries, but it's important to consider how changes in the economy and in the labor market relate to the movement of people, essentially. So when we're trying to think through this, a really useful theorist who has some really interesting points to make about this is Saskia Sassen. So Saskia Sassen is focused on trying to understand the kind of interlocking social, political, economic, and kind of cultural dimensions of globalization. And she's interested particularly in the mobility of labor, and by that she means the mobility of people around the world. So Sassen Sesson essentially argues that in in our kind of developed, in our globalized world, we in our era of global interconnectivity, we have what you would call global cities. So these are places that are very cosmopolitan, multicultural cities that are the kind of in the kind of engine or the command center of the global economy. So somewhere like London, somewhere like New York, where many organizations have their head offices, where decisions are made, and where there's a concentration of people working essentially. So she's interested in how the kind of changes in labor in these global cities has had a kind of knock-on effect, or has a relationship with labor and the movement of people in parts of the global south. So Sasson particularly looks at the kind of migration of labor, focusing on women. So she's interested in women from parts of the global south. So we can use the case of the Philippines as the kind of paradigm sending country. She's interested in essentially people coming from places like the Philippines to places like London, New York, to work and earn money, and then send that money back to their sending country, back to somewhere like the Philippines to support their families. So this is a enormous global trend, and it's really facilitated by the way that people in many of these kind of developed like global north kind of global cities are working. So there's a rise of households in which like the two kind of adults are both working, often full time. So that means that there's a need for someone to be doing the kind of unpaid or typically unpaid domestic labor, caring labor, things like that. So often that goes to people that are earning minimum wage or below minimum wage, and it often goes to migrant workforces who come from places like the Philippines to take up jobs as nannies and cleaners and all of this kind of like domestic household labor that's essentially being outsourced. And so Saskia Sassen calls this dynamic where, in one direction, countries like the Philippines are kind of sending women, because it is predominantly women, because there's a gendered element to the type of labor that's done. It's generally domestic labor. And then in that other direction is money in the form of remittances, which is the term for money that's sent back from someone that's working overseas to support their family back in their country of origin. So Sasson calls this a survival circuit, a way for people who are living in the global south to support themselves in the context of very slim opportunities in the labour market and an absence of any kind of welfare state. So I've got a really quick YouTube video of an interview with Sasson, just to give you a sense of a bit more about what she's kind of talking about in her work on globalization. So I'm just going to give you a minute to take a look at that. It's only a few minutes, and then we'll come back and kind of keep going with the lecture.